Finland contingent here. And we're both working in the area of music and autism, but particularly entrainment and synchronization. So our aim today is, if you're unfamiliar with this topic, that you come away with more understanding and maybe some ideas of your own research. And then also to give us opportunities to kind of brainstorm and think together about ways that we can address this topic better as a field.
Yes, so a very quick overview. We'll first quickly do a general overview of what is autism and related to the literature on entrainment, and discuss on some of the challenges that have been arised in this research, and we'll be giving then 2 case examples of how we have been trying to overcome those challenges. And we'll finish up with some discussion among all the participants so that we can also interactively discuss about these topics.
Okay, so we actually don't know what your backgrounds are about in this topic. Raise your hand if you have any familiarity with autism, practical or clinical or personal. A little bit, okay. All right, so some and some newbies, which is great. We could spend an entire hour or 2 just on the research and literature, giving you this background. So I'll keep it at a basic level for now, but please feel free to ask questions either now or later on. So autism is generally defined as a neurodevelopmental disorder, and its diagnostic criteria at the moment, these do change sometimes, but right now the criteria are that a child has difficulty with social communication and has a pattern of restrictive and repetitive behaviors. Now these are very, very broad categories, such that the social interaction difficulty piece could look something like a child having minimal ability to speak verbally, maybe using picture cards to communicate or sign language, but it could be also that someone has full verbal communication but struggles to read social cues. So there's a very wide range of what this can mean. And similarly with the restrictive and repetitive behaviors, that can look in some people like very, very narrow interests in certain areas. I had a client once in music therapy who spoke of nothing but air conditioners. So it can be like that, or it can be something that's a little bit more behavioral, kind of the classic sign you see in the picture here is that you might see a child engaging with toys where they are placing them in a row, only stacking, maybe playing with a toy only in a certain way, playing with the wheels rather than playing in an imaginary way. And these are just a few of many, many, many examples of what these criteria can look like. So in addition to the main 2 requirements for an autism diagnosis, we often see other things as well. Often there are sensory issues. Autistic children can be hypo or hypersensitive to sound or touch. It can change. Sometimes they're hypersensitive in one moment and hyposensitive in another moment. So that creates a number of challenges. Very, very common for these children to have sleep problems. Co-occurring diagnoses also happen very often, ADHD, learning disabilities. And the one that's interesting for us here the most is that there seem to be in most, possibly all, diagnosed people with autism difficulties with motor skills, fine motor skills and gross motor skills, and ability to time motor interactions with others, which is very interesting for us. And just to give you a sort of one language that we use for describing different levels of autism is this 3-level system, where level 1 could mean that a child or an adult requires a little bit of support or some special training, And then level 2 is sort of a middle area, and level 3, which is the level I worked with as a music therapist most of my time in the clinical field, refers to people who need help most of the time in most areas, and usually do for life. So we have a range of people who graduate college and get PhDs and work and live with minimal assistance, although they have struggles, to people who need basic assistance for their entire lives amid one diagnosis. So the movement piece. There is more and more literature all the time showing that there is a motor difficulty in autism. There has been some debate recently in the literature about whether motor issues should be part of the diagnostic criteria. It has not been decided, but there are certainly a number of researchers who feel strongly it should be part of the diagnostic criteria. There seems to be a correlation between how severe the motor difficulties are and how severe the autism is. And both in terms of the social functioning, sometimes in terms of cognitive ability in general. There's also some studies showing that the worse the language difficulty is, that there may be a motor component there. There's understanding that although there's many different things going on neurobiologically, it does seem that the cerebellum, which is of course related to timing and precise motor control, does seem to be an area of abnormality in autism. And then synchrony, which is of course why we're all here. The literature here is somewhat mixed, but it does seem to be that difficulties with synchrony may be a marker of ASD, and there's been quite a bit of interest about that as a potential area for intervention as well. So the literature about ASD and synchrony, we have seen that struggling with synchrony may be an early sign of autism, especially in terms of rhythmic development, especially in social contexts. And as we all know, there is literature outside of autism linking this ability to synchronize, to be together in time, to our social abilities. Think of the literature showing that children who synchronize on a drum with an adult are subsequently engaging in pro-social behavior more than those who don't synchronize, for example. So there seems to be some connection here. But there are a lot of difficulties with this as well. There are studies out there that look at synchrony in autism and say, no, there's no problem. It's just exactly the way it is for typical people. And there are a lot of issues of why this can happen. Study design is, of course, one. How we're measuring synchrony. We've talked here a bit about micro-timing and beat bin sizes, and that's something that's not been investigated, for example. Another issue, which we'll talk a bit more about, is, as I said, the spectrum is incredibly wide. So it's often much easier for us as researchers to interact with participants on the side of the spectrum who are higher functioning, who maybe have verbal capacity, who are, it's easier to get permission from them to participate. So that creates a bias in our research for who we're studying and how. And then the things that we kind of often see with research on special populations, small sample sizes, lack of blinding, and then we're not sure about whether this is something that we can use for rehabilitation.
Yes. So just to continue. No? Okay, yes. And especially also defining entrainment with this population, because as we have, as Emily was explaining, ASD is characterized by having a wide range of severity in the spectrum. Also, we'll touch upon this a bit later, but defining the population can be sometimes tricky when describing if they are at risk of ASD or other diagnoses or already diagnosed, because ASD usually comes a bit later in age, so with very young children, depends a bit on the country and culture that we're talking about, but with very young children, they might not have a confirmed diagnosis yet. Another challenge quite relevant for the topic also that we are touching upon these days is how well our movement studies of typically functioning people are actually provide a basis for movement variable in people diagnosed with ASD. Another quite important question is how to best establish and investigate a causal relationship of entrainment and social skills with people with ASD. And then we also encounter pragmatic issues, as in many other research, with ethical issues, which is specifically important when talking about people with disabilities, and what does consent mean for them, and how to make sure that we have their consent. Some also data methods such as markers or neuroimaging procedures might not be completely adapted to this collective. And also another more on a philosophical level is how to really make the research process inclusive. So how to include them along the whole process, but also how to make sure that what we are investigating is relevant for them and is important for them. So now we've been talking for a bit, and we'd like you to just quickly, like for 5-10 minutes, discuss with someone that you're sitting next to, like nearby. You're also very welcome to move around, like just self-organize. You can discuss in general terms how you would think these challenges that we've just explained, how they could be addressed in research. It can also be thinking about your own research projects. And also you're very welcome to think about some other big questions that might have come to mind while we were explaining the ASD characteristics and this research. So yeah, and then we'll just ask later for maybe a couple of comments. So yes.
Yeah, maybe just for about 5 minutes, have a little chat. And especially think about your own methods and research expertise and how this may relate. Okay, we're very glad that everyone's chatty, and we'll give you some more time to talk about these things in a little bit. Yes, let's continue. Hello, let's continue. We're super excited that you really want to talk about this, and I promise we'll give you some more time later on. But would somebody like to share a little bit what they discussed in your groups? After this, we'll share how we've tried to address these issues, but what are some of your initial thoughts? They only want to talk to each other, not to us.
One thing we were kind of wondering a bit is in relation to parents seeing their children and maybe not wanting to accept or go through the diagnostic process of them. Is that super prevalent, or?
It depends on the culture and the location. I grew up working in the US, where there's a lot of drive for early identification, early intervention. So being diagnosed as soon as possible is a big value there. Whereas now we're working in Finland, where there can be sometimes more resistance to having children diagnosed. This is especially relevant when we're talking about levels 1 and 2, where it may not necessarily be so obvious and not as easy to see that the child needs some support and help. But yes, that can definitely be an issue.
Yeah, I'm not at all familiar with the broader literature, but from talking to some people, I've heard that there seems to be a distinction between people with autism who kind of see it as part of the identity versus as like with this, almost like a disease, and maybe that gives access to support in some things depending on the country and the health system and that sort of thing. Is that something that comes under definition and population? And if it is that something that's generally now taken into account by researchers in the field? And how do you address this? Because it is maybe
that's a great question.
Ethical implications too, doesn't
it? And it definitely is an issue. Sort of 20 years ago, you were doing research in autism, there was sort of really a let's try to fix it, let's try to cure it focus, and that's really not seen as ethical anymore. And again, there's a lot of that depends both on the individual's view of autism and a lot on their functioning level as well. I would say the definition of autism is so broad currently that for some people it truly may not be a disorder, and if they don't see it as a disorder or disability themselves, I do not consider it my job to tell them otherwise. So kind of pragmatically, my approach is if you were looking for support and you want help, that's what our job is as researchers. Also pragmatically, we do have to be very careful and sensitive with how we speak about autism. I kind of interchangeably use person with autism, autistic child, autistic person. Some people very strongly prefer one or very strongly prefer the other. So speaking-wise, I use both. When we write a paper, usually we pick one and explain why. But that is another big topic that can fill an entire session. Should we keep going? Okay, so first I'll talk about my study, and then Alicia will talk about her study. So mainly to try to address the issues of having a naturalistic setting and being inclusive were my main focuses in this research project. This is a really small research grant from Sempre to kind of do a proof of concept of using markerless motion capture to study autism and music therapy. So the aim was to basically find out if we can do it. Markerless systems are fairly new, and most of the commercial development is looking at things like sports movement. So when we've been working on developing this for music in our lab, sometimes the people we're in contact with are a bit surprised that we're not doing 5-second trials over and over again of someone throwing a ball. No, I have 30 minutes of a child playing a xylophone with somebody else, and they're running around, and it's complicated. So this was a big technological challenge for the most part, and then also kind of a conceptual challenge of, can we show something meaningful happening in a therapy session based on the movement? Can I not attach anything to these children who may not be able to tolerate sensors on them and still get some meaningful data that shows us when something good or something we hope is good is happening? So kind of very low threshold goals, but it was tough to get there. The aim was to have 10 clients. We ended up with 6 clients who had 4 music therapy sessions. They were, I gave no restrictions to the therapists. I told them just do whatever you would normally do in music therapy for these children, rather than try to have any specific goals. They knew that we were interested in movement and entrainment, but they were therapists first. We did the therapy sessions in our motion capture lab in Uvascula, which now has these 12 Miquis Qualisys Markerless cameras, which are quite expensive, and it was a bit terrifying to bring children in who are a bit unpredictable, and I feel very lucky that my university supports me in doing that. And we were successful in getting data into the computer, which was the main goal. Yeah, you can play it because there's no sound. I'll just talk over it. So from the camera data, we used the program Theia Markerless to extract the 3D data. If you want to know more about that, please don't ask me. Ask Martin, who's there in the stripes. And from there, we were able to get to more familiar territory for me, which was the motion capture toolbox, which I believe there's a session coming up about that next hour. And we were able to make things work. Sometimes the clients didn't behave well, sometimes the computers didn't behave well. You can see that there was some less than realistic data collection there. But we also got some really great interactions as well, really sort of amazing moments where we had one client who wasn't very responsive in the first session and came in with their own music the next time and had these amazing dance interactions with the therapists and left all of us in the lab going, that was incredible. And we have the data just to show it. And I'm just in the beginning of trying to make sense of the data from a numeric standpoint, and I won't belabor my attempts to do that because, again, I encourage you to go to the MCT Toolbox workshop and the next session because you'll learn a lot about that. But the crux of what this shows here is that in this video, there's not a whole lot of interaction entrainment going on. You can see that the colors, which are showing cross-wavelet entrainment, are kind of flat, whereas in this one here, you see that there's entrainment going on at multiple frequency levels, which is also quite cool because they're in a seated position, so there's already some limits of what movement is possible, but we're still seeing quite a lot of entrainment, so that's good. And I believe that we have at least succeeded in the goal of showing that we can show something meaningful from this data, and I will continue to do more analysis on it, which will hopefully result in a paper at some point. So yeah, I sort of said this at the beginning, but so this was addressing the naturalism using Markerless capture and define the population. What we did for this was we just asked, we recruited through parents. We said, is your child diagnosed? We assumed the parents would tell us the truth, which is fairly good assumption, but not perfect, obviously. But that was the solution we had in this case. and wasn't a design that really can address the causal relationship at all. All we can really do with this is show, here's where entrainment is happening, here is where it isn't happening. Once I get into the data, maybe we can show more entrainment in later sessions as opposed to earlier sessions, or more entrainment in clients who are less severely affected as opposed to those who are more severely affected. But there's not a possibility for causal work here. And pragmatically, I was able to include clients who were nonverbal, so they couldn't have given their own first-person verbal responses in any way, but they were able to contribute their own first-person data through movement. So I'm very excited about that and proud of it. A lot of pragmatic challenges with the Markerless system. Like I said, it's new, we're learning it. The data is very, very big because we're not collecting 10-second clips of somebody throwing a ball, we're collecting sessions. And I think one client was about as much data as a feature film for every single client, so that was a lot, and we've had to work on that. And then the other question I have about Markerless is how accurate is the data? As Alicia said, the baselines that we have for movement are based on typically developing populations, and particularly with Markerless, the Theia system is based on algorithms that have learned on non-autistic adults. So is the data that it's giving me about these kids as accurate as it can be? Possibly not, but that's something to explore in the future.
Okay, so I'll present the second case example. This study is a study that we are currently recruiting participants, and we should be starting data collection next Wednesday, unless something happens. So I'll just mainly talk about the planning and the design. And for a bit of context, this study is a longitudinal study that will be happening during 2 years in public daycares of Jyväskylä in Finland. And the main goal of the study is to explore the effects of music and or physical education in children's social emotional development. So for this, our aim is to recruit 120 participants, and 40 of them will be receiving weekly music lessons, 40 of them will be receiving physical education lessons, and then the other 40 will just continue with their typical routine of being at daycare. We have measurements that are focusing on just the children, either between them or with an assistant, and the tasks involve social, emotions, and executive functions. We also have some reports by the caregivers of the children about their social, emotional development, and also by the staff from the daycare, so the ones that are every day with them. And we'll have some external observations conducted during the intervention group, so during music and physical education. So just for a bit of better understanding, and then I'll move into the more like the ASD part, our main research question is how does participating in music or physical education training during 2 years affect children's social emotional development and children's executive function. But as part of this, and what it's more related to this presentation and to this workshop, is we'll have a subgroup of children that might be at risk of ASD. So every children will be screened for at-risk symptoms. And the main reason why we are always talking about at risk is because these children will be 4-year-olds when they start the study, and they will be 6 when they finish. And in Finland, it's quite rare that at that age, the children will have a confirmed diagnosis of ASD. They start primary school at the age of 7, and that's usually when the formal diagnosis comes. So that's why we are mainly talking of at-risk population. But in terms of this group, our research question is how does music training affect the social development of children diagnosed or identified as being at risk for ASD, and how that relates to also their entrainment skills, if that will predict better social skills or not. So we'll have some measurements related to entrainment across the 2 years, and then I'll quickly explain how both interventions will be working with entrainment and how we have conceptualized it. So what I mentioned before was one of the challenges, how to define entrainment in naturalistic and with this population. So for the context of this group, we've established and defining a social motor entrainment, meaning that they will always first start with the whole group, and then they will move on to by pairs and training with pairs, and then with from very big, from the whole group to smaller groups, also because of the age, they're very young. And in terms of the intervention groups, we'll have music and physical education, which they have a lot of similarities. So we are also very interested in analyzing these similarity components, but also are there differentiate factors between them, and what are these factors that can affect the social emotional development. And in terms of entrainment, we have conceptualized it as that the musical groups will be focusing quite heavily on acoustic entrainment, so there will be a lot of components related to sound education during the groups. And in the physical education groups, it will be more about visual entrainment, focusing on gross motor skills and gestures. As I said, the population is defined as at risk due to the issues that I explained before. And as for the causal relationship, we'll have the longitudinal study during 2 years with 3 testing times. The measurement of entrainment, it is based on a tapping task and also on a perception timing task, so they will be tapping freely as they want. And that would also be happen during the 2 years to analyze how also that changes with the at-risk and non-at-risk children. This will also be associated with the other factors of the emotional development and social skills as well. The main, as in the pragmatic level, we have, of course, need to take into account that at-risk population and with this young age, it might mean that they might not, of course, confirm the diagnosis later. It might also be showing some comorbidity with some other diagnosis or some other aspects. And also in terms of the inclusive process, this all will be happening in the daycare settings and during the schedules, during the everyday daycare schedule, also the measurements. Also, in order to encourage the agency of the children, although they're very young, but of course in the research process, all the interventions are very learner-focused. So there is the plan, but of course we need to remember their needs of every day. So.
All right, so that is how we have are currently attempting to address this complicated but we feel very important research topic. And I promise to give you some more time to chat. I'm not really sure how we're doing on time, but 12 minutes. Okay, so maybe for another 5 or 6 minutes, you can talk again in your groups. One thing we're really interested in is if you have different methods than we do, which I'm sure you do, you all have many different areas of expertise in entrainment and how we research it, how can you apply that maybe to autism research, or how might it apply theoretically? Always useful question for grants, for example, but also I really hope that you're interested potentially in studying this topic. So you can think about that, as well as we feel the causal relationship is quite challenging to tease out. If there's some thoughts or ideas that you have you want to discuss in your group, that's also interesting and important. And then we also, if you have some thoughts about defining entrainment in this kind of naturalistic context, that's another important question for discussion. So you can get back in your groups and have a little bit more of a chat, and then we'll finish up in about 7 or 8 minutes. Good. All right, let's continue as the big group. We only have about 5 minutes left, but since there's a break afterwards, we can keep chatting if you like. Okay. Does anyone have comments or of what they discussed, or ideas, or questions? Please.
I raised it inside our group a bit on the use of VR or AR as a methodological tool because you have control also over eye gaze, posture proximity, so it's easy to manipulate certain variables that might be useful and also make it more game-like or fun for a certain population, using augmented reality and maybe not very humanistic like avatars, but maybe some more fun or game-like character to investigate these kind of things.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, actually, and I guess you would have quite a bit of control over how stimulating or not the visual environment was too, which can be a big issue, a big challenge for some kids particularly. Yeah, I've heard about some VR-related research for stroke rehabilitation, but not for ASD as far as I know. So, yeah, great idea. Go for it.
It's not so much a question as a comment. We were just talking about like the fact that autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, that might just be a third variable, like later symptoms and the motor dysfunction or rhythm differences.
Yeah, I would say that it's really not entirely clear from the research where in sort of the developmental chain the synchronization motor issues happen. I did read recently that in infants who are later diagnosed with autism that there is an abnormal timing in brainstem reaction to auditory stimuli. So it may be that auditory related timing is a core issue, but truthfully we don't know a lot yet.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if there's been any meta-analysis study that doesn't involve it. That doesn't involve intervention of any sort, just to see if there's a correlation between kids with musical parents and incidence of ASD, with the assumption being parents of musical backgrounds have children with higher entrainment ability, whether it's nature or nurture.
Not that I know of either, but that's a really interesting question. And nature or nurture, we would have both there too, because presumably parents who are musical are doing a lot of music with their kids when they're very, very young. I sing to my daughter more than I speak to her. So not at all that I know, but that would be very interesting to explore.
I think we have 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Do you want to do a concluding statement?
Yeah.
Or
This went by really quickly. We'd love to have even more time for discussion, and please feel free to find either of us to chat more afterwards if you have any thoughts or ideas, and contact us via email as well. Anything to add? These are brilliant affiliations and wonderful support, and so we thank them and we thank you.